My friends, in politics, no one is remotely indispensable.
The world turned upside down. In a matter of days, Boris Johnson's leadership fell apart.
In the last few minutes, news that the Health Secretary, Sajid Javid, has just resigned. Rishi Sunak has just announced his resignation.
5 ministers resigning in one go.
He was my boss, and if you haven't got confidence, you just should be honest with them as well as yourself.
Some of us are still absolutely shell-shocked.
I think it's very sad, but it's politics. I mean, it's a bit like in The Godfather when they do unspeakable things.
A scandal too far.
I was just feeling this headache is just not going away.
Another story that didn't add up.
In hindsight, it was the wrong thing to do.
You can't lie your way through crises, you've got to tell the truth.
I've followed Boris Johnson's dizzying ups and his crashes down for nearly 10 years.
I thought I got through this interview already, folks. I mean, what's going on? She keeps asking me questions.
Despite mess after mess, Boris Johnson was adamant he'd stay in number 10. But even the great survivor couldn't stop his downfall.
Them's the breaks.
Tonight, what on earth went on?
Good morning, colleagues. Thank you very much.
It was no secret that Boris Johnson had been in trouble. But the cameras in Cabinet were meant to show business as usual.
We are now able to introduce, as of tomorrow, the single biggest tax cut in a decade.
He didn't know that 2 men at the table were thinking about when to quit.
On that Tuesday morning, I hadn't totally made up my mind, but it was really, I was really wrestling with it. I had started thinking about, maybe I'd had enough in terms of what I could put up with, and to go and see the Prime Minister and just tender my resignation, because I don't think you can work for someone that you haven't got confidence anymore. It's just the principal value that I have.
I think for some time we've been aware that it was getting more and more challenging and people's patience was being stretched. We all knew that we were in very tricky territory. We all knew that there were all sorts of sort of storm clouds gathering and that it was going to be difficult.
Thank you very much, Tiz.
The Prime Minister has made a career of scraping through scandals. For some voters, his flaws are part of his appeal. So what was it this time that would mean the end?
The Conservative Deputy Chief Whip has resigned from government, saying that he drank far too much last night and embarrassed himself and other people.
A relatively obscure member of the government, Chris Pincher, was in the news for all the wrong reasons, accused of groping 2 men at a private club. He denies it. The big problem? There'd been other claims.
We get to this week, the Pincher episode is growing and growing. It went from the sort of 3rd item on the news agenda to the top of the agenda, partly because of the way we handled it.
Boris Johnson had been told of a similar complaint before he'd given Chris Pincher a job in his team. But that wasn't the story given to ministers to tell the rest of us.
I have been given a categorical assurance that the Prime Minister was not aware of any specific allegation or complaint made against the former Deputy Chief Whip, Chris Pincher.
It took a former civil servant to force the government to tell the truth.
The categorical assurance was wrong.
What do you make of that?
I do not think that is the way to behave.
I found the allegations in concerning the former Deputy Chief Whip and then the response to that, I'm afraid I'd reached the end of the road.
A minister was sent out badly briefed with things which turned out to be untrue, and clearly you can't lie your way through crises, you've got to tell the truth.
Someone who was a senior minister, until a few days ago at least, told me you could argue that the mess around Chris Pincher was sordid but not disastrous, yet it confirmed a view for most people around here that the Downing Street operation just wasn't working. And it riled them because it wasn't the first time that Number 10 had responded to a problem with a version of events that ministers were instructed to repeat on TV that a few days later turned out not to be true. Downing Street's version of events had unravelled. Boris Johnson had to admit it was wrong.
Day after day after day, people speaking on your behalf were talking rubbish.
I don't know. I wasn't. I'm afraid focusing on other things at the time. But what I'm telling you now is my recollection of events.
What I was being told on whether it's on parties or other things from people working in Number 10, some people, was they're trying to reassure me, listen, there's nothing to see here, it's not a problem. So I gave the benefit of the doubt.
I was sent out to do the media rounds every so often, and you'd go on to talk about something that was really important, you were really excited about, you hoped was going to make a real difference, and it got sort of sidetracked into discussions about other things.
Ministers clearly began to think that they couldn't rely on the briefings they were being given by Number 10. Once you reach that point, it really is over, and so we've seen.
The Conservative Party had been here before. It had barely recovered from the intense embarrassment over parties during lockdown under Boris Johnson's roof. Remember, at the start, we were all told no rules had been broken at all.
All guidance was followed completely.
I have been repeatedly assured that there was no party and that no COVID rules were broken.
Yet in the end, there was evidence of booze, parties and late nights while the country was in lockdown. The Prime Minister himself was found to have broken the rules and broken the law.
I paid the fine immediately, and I offered the British people a full apology.
Some MPs had already tried to shove him out.
You have sat there too long for all the good you have done. In the name of God, go.
The reason I came to that view was because I thought, actually, there was no doubt that Boris was misleading the House, was attempting to wriggle out of responsibility for things, and I took the view that there would be a pipeline of problems, not just one problem, but a pipeline of problems coming down the track. We would just return to this issue time and time and time again.
Anger over parties in Number 10 left a smouldering fear of more scandal to come. Some ministers had been embarrassed, unhappy for months. And two disastrous by-election results made things worse.
It's time to show Boris the door.
But once Number 10's untruths about Chris Pincher emerged, it was time for some cabinet ministers to strike.
Rishi Sunak is no longer Chancellor, suggesting Boris Johnson isn't competent or serious, while Sajid Javid resigns from health, questioning the Prime Minister's integrity.
I got my resignation letter ready, I signed it, but I wasn't going to tell anyone other than the PM first. I went to see him, and he was in Parliament, in his office there, and I explained to him that I'm resigning now. I've resigned, and obviously he didn't want me to, but he understood.
Instantly, I thought, this is serious. I think if you lose your health secretary and your chancellor, that for me, that was definitely the moment where it was game over.
It had taken less than 10 minutes for Boris Johnson to lose two of his most senior colleagues.
I thought it was odd of them to have resigned in an orchestrated way that they did. I also think when people start talking about their own integrity, you want to be quite suspicious about that.
You're accusing them of betraying Boris Johnson?
Well, I think, you'd have to sort of believe anything if you thought that the resignations weren't coordinated.
I had no idea that he was planning to resign. We hadn't had any single discussion about it whatsoever. I had a feeling that other people would follow because I felt from, especially speaking to some of my sort of more junior colleagues in the weeks previously, there was definitely a sense of one sort of senior members of the government, cabinet members like myself, doing something about this.
I was quite stunned that there were people who thought that removing the Prime Minister is one of the biggest majority that we've had since Margaret Thatcher in less than 3 years. Just the anti-democratic nature of what they're doing alone was enough to alarm me. And I think I was pretty... And for me, it was a coup.
Rishi Sunak strongly denies coordinating with Sajid Javid. But Boris Johnson was now in deep, deep trouble.
Minutes to 8, the drama in Westminster across the front pages, of course.
The Sun says Boris Johnson's got a last chance, as it put it. Time is running out. The Telegraph says the political crisis must now be resolved. The Times says game over.
By 9 a.m, there'd already been a dozen resignations.
I got to a stage where I just had to, I couldn't do it anymore. And so I took that decision, and it was impossibly hard to do. Not that I ever thought about how I'd write a resignation letter, but I found myself drafting it around the school run on the Wednesday morning. That's how quick it was.
Any other Prime Minister would have headed for the door himself. Then Boris Johnson's old frenemy arrived. Michael Gove turned up with a message. With so many ministers going, including in his own department, with more to come, it was over. He told his boss he should spare himself the embarrassment of being dragged down by backbenchers. But Mr. Johnson told him he would fight and believed he could stay. Remember, it was Michael Gove who spiked Boris Johnson's attempt to become Prime Minister back in 2016. An awkward echo of the two men's tricky past. Later, Boris Johnson would reward him with the sack. By the time the Prime Minister arrived at the Commons to face Keir Starmer, 4 more people had resigned.
Then there was Prime Minister's questions.
Mr. Speaker, isn't this the first recorded case of the sinking ships fleeing the rats?
It's hard to describe the feeling of the sort of the cauldron and the heat and the mood and the atmosphere. And it was obvious then that we were into some irreversible process.
It was grim. You know, MPs who were shouting to support the Prime Minister just the week before were sat there stony-faced.
We now come to the personal statement I call Sajid Javid.
The recently departed Health Secretary piled on the pressure.
At some point, we have to conclude that enough is enough. I believe that point is now. I have concluded that the problem starts at the top, and I believe that is not going to change.
Yet at that stage, there was no budging Boris Johnson.
Does the Prime Minister think there are any circumstances in which he should resign?
Frankly, Mr. Speaker, the job of a Prime Minister in difficult circumstances when he's been handed a colossal mandate is to keep going, and that's what I'm going to do.
Boris Johnson leads the Conservatives to a resounding election victory.
We did it! We pulled it off, didn't we?
The memory of his massive 2019 election victory gave him faith he could survive. Protestations in Parliament could be drowned out by public support of years before.
The fact that he saved us from the constitutional crisis of 2019, took us out of the EU and defeated a very hard left opposition. Those are all great things which I celebrate, and I would like us to be remembering that that's what Boris Johnson achieved rather than the sordid events of the last week.
He's globally respected for the way in which we've handled Ukraine, and particularly the vaccine rollout. Actually, he will be remembered for getting the big calls right, even if it was the smaller calls which did for him in the end.
But you knew Boris Johnson was flawed when you helped put him in office.
Everybody's flawed. Everybody's flawed.
The odd flaw is one thing, but a series of intense embarrassments is another. The eye-wateringly expensive decoration of the Downing Street flat, paid for by a party donor.
Are you worried about the investigation, Prime Minister? Who coughed up for the flat, sir?
An attempt to change Parliament's rules to save a political pal, Owen Paterson. Not one, but 2 ethics advisors who quit, aghast at what was going on. There'd been months of trouble and repeated promises to change.
This was becoming a little bit too repetitive. Inevitably, I think there is always a point at which patience begins to get stretched. I think there was this feeling, this headache is just not going away.
Some mistakes have been made, which are the flip side of the Prime Minister's personality, that he is a big personality that deals with big issues, and to my mind he got all the big issues right. On the other hand, he's not necessarily the hottest on the small issues.
Isn't telling the truth also a big issue?
No, I don't think that's right. I think the Prime Minister is a basically truthful man.
By mid-afternoon on Wednesday, ministers were rushing for the door.
It was plain as a pikestaff that government was bleeding ministers almost faster than they could replace them.
By 6 o'clock, 38 members of the government had walked away. That's just a staggering number. And members of the cabinet had finally come here to demand that he quit. But Boris Johnson wouldn't budge then from what increasingly felt like a bunker, claiming there was still a chance that he could turn things around. One of them present told me Number 10 were dangling promotions to try to stave off the onslaught, sketching out a reshuffle on a whiteboard in the office. They said it felt Number 10 believed they could just move things around, sing Rule Britannia and stick their fingers in their ears, and it would all be fine. Downing Street says all appointments are made on merit. Welsh Secretary Simon Hart was one of those who told the boss to go.
It was harder than I thought it would be, and it was sadder than I thought it would be. I think the options were pretty limited by then, to be honest, and I think Boris was probably as aware of that as anybody. But being Boris, I think he always thought, one more roll of the dice and something miraculous will occur. But I thought we were just past that point. So I did say to him, look, I think we've reached the end of the road.
Simon Hart later resigned himself. The band of Boris Johnson supporters was getting smaller, but they were still standing by their man.
I was never going to desert him, and I was never going to betray him. And my advice initially was to fight on.
One member of Camp Johnson told me there was a sense of being bewildered. They were aware they were in trouble, but they didn't think it was terminal. And a clutch of cabinet ministers arrived and took that side too, questioning whether outside this postcode things were really that bad at all. There were hours of tortured discussion, Boris Johnson still telling colleagues he could and should stay, shored up by a dwindling bunch of colleagues. But they were losing the argument. As Boris Johnson left the office for his flat upstairs, he was realising the fight was in vain.
But when the intelligence came in as to who was going to resign the next day and who was going to be handing their letters in, it became apparent we can't withstand this. And he made the decision late that night that he would stand down the following morning.
After less than 3 years in the job he'd craved for a lifetime, by around 5 a.m, Boris Johnson had admitted to staff it was over.
As I speak to you, I'm getting a call from Downing Street. The Prime Minister has agreed to stand down.
It had taken nearly 60 members of Boris Johnson's government resigning to make sure he quit.
In the last few days, I've tried to persuade my colleagues that it would be eccentric to change governments when we're delivering so much and when we have such a vast mandate and when we're actually only a handful of points behind in the polls. But as we've seen at Westminster, the herd instinct is powerful. When the herd moves, it moves. And my friends, in politics, no one is remotely indispensable.
Vintage Johnson Those who shoved him out branded eccentric. Little sign of remorse.
Thank you all very much. Thank you.
In the end, it's simple. Tory MPs had just had enough. Boris Johnson's anarchic style, his devil-may-care attitude, had taken him and them a long way. It had given them power, an opportunity. But many of them were sick of cleaning up his mess, sick of not being able to trust what was coming out of Number 10, sick of Downing Street's attitude to the truth. The Tory circus revolved around Boris Johnson for so long, but within hours, it was all about who's next. And there was a perfect occasion for the candidates to strut their stuff.
Mr. Hancock, are you going to throw your hat into the ring, sir?
No, I'm not going to throw my hat into the ring, but I am going to go into the party.
On a day like this, it is an extraordinary coincidence that it is the Spectator magazine summer party. The Spectator is basically the sort of house magazine of the Conservative Party. It's even the magazine that Boris Johnson himself used to edit. And on the day that they've got rid of him, the top cream of sort of Tory society will all be piling into there, along with lots of journalists. There are a couple of hundred people, the sort of A-list of the Tory party, like Michael Gove.
Oh, evening.
Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor, until a few days ago, Nadeem Zahawi. And they're all in there, pressing the flesh, schmoozing, having the odd whisper in the odd ear. There's some very powerful people in there with a lot of money and a lot of influence. Boris Johnson's leadership was barely over, but the race to replace him had already started.
Nothing is settled. That is the sense this morning as the nation comes to terms with yesterday's events.
The tension is so ruthlessly turned to the next big race. Who will be the next Prime Minister?
I'm running to be our next Prime Minister because it's your stories that matter most.
It wasn't long before potential successors showed their hand. The finger was pointed at Rishi Sunak for seeming suspiciously well prepared when his glossy campaign video emerged.
Yes, we know that some people were organising their campaigns sometime beforehand, and that is indicative of ambition, it seems to me.
How would you describe then what's happened to Boris Johnson?
I think it's very sad, but it's politics. I mean, it's a bit like in The Godfather when they do unspeakable things. And the business of politics is ensuring that you have a leadership that you want. And I wanted the leadership that was Boris Johnson, and I lost. And that is how politics goes.
Who will be our next Prime Minister? 4 have officially put their hats in the ring.
By the weekend, more contenders were entering the race. 4 became 6, then 7 and more. No shortage of Tories bristling with ambition to replace the old boss.
And so it begins. While Boris Johnson glowers from behind the black door at Number 10, the beauty parade has begun outside.
The studios soon filled up with those trying to grab the top job. The Sunday morning, like political encounters, is this big shop window for all of the people who are now trying to take over from Boris Johnson. How do they say, oh, I wasn't responsible for any of the bad bits, but take credit for the good bits? Yeah. It's just this kind of Piccadilly circus as they're all like desperate to get on the telly and tell people what they stand for. How long have you been waiting to do this?
The contest?
Yeah.
Well, I didn't think it was going to happen quite as quickly, actually.
Look at that, you think. Have fun.
Thank you.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Do you think the very fact that you have not served in Boris Johnson's government helps you in this contest?
In one important way, yes, because there are...
Just going to say hello. I'm fine. How are you? You've got one leadership candidate who's just gone off to one lift. One of the other people who's trying to be the Prime Minister is sitting in another room waiting to go on.
OK.
British
Power, off you go. I do hope you'll join me next Sunday. In the meantime, enjoy the sunshine. Goodbye.
After a frantic few days in Westminster, the contest to succeed Boris Johnson as Prime Minister will not be settled until September. There are recriminations already about how it started. Rishi Sunak appears to be in front. Sajid Javid is out of the running. Boris Johnson is bust, but is the Tory party too. Those vying to take over hope not. But what has he left behind? Without question, he's a Prime Minister that matters and always will. He took us out of the European Union and that changed the course of our history.
You were never going to get just, an ordinary Joe. We all knew that. We knew what Boris was like before we voted him. I've heard over the past few days many members of the public saying, we know what he's like. That's why we voted for him. We make gaffes, we make mistakes, we haven't got perfect lives. And we voted for Brexit. That's why we voted for him.
I think we always thought with Boris Johnson it was a little bit death or glory. He might, we always knew it was going to be a roller coaster ride.
There was never any doubting his ambition. The last few manic years, politically, belonged to him. Yet there were always doubts about his ability to do the job, his troubled relationship with the truth, his desire to court controversy that sometimes drowned everything else out.
The truth is, across the board, it's quite plain that people don't approve of Boris's behaviour. That's plainly the case. And to some extent, they are cross with us for taking so long to deal with it.
I hope one day we can sit down, have a drink together, and I'd look forward to it. But I think that we have to step back a bit and that we're professionals. We have a duty, and you've got to feel that you have the ability to discharge those responsibilities. And I think if you don't have confidence in your boss, it becomes incredibly hard to do just that.
Boris Johnson's chapter ends after countless wild political tales. Yet this crazy finale holds no straightforward solutions to the serious problems the country faces now.
A leather rhinoceros and a pocket-sized racing car, both up for some TLC next on BBC One. More transformations in the repair shop.